Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, not in your cozy bed with your phone buzzing, but in a golden palace where the walls shimmer with intricate tiles and the air is heavy with jasmine and incense. Sounds like a dream, doesn't it? Silk sheets, endless feasts, servants at your every whim. Now imagine you're a woman, barely 15, and those palace walls aren't a home. They're a prison. A prison so beautiful it masks a nightmare. Welcome to the imperial harem at Topkapi Palace, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a place history books love to romanticize but would rather you forget. Because inside this so-called paradise, 400 women lived in constant terror, knowing that a single biological function, like your monthly period, could get you strangled with a silk cord. Or worse, if you got pregnant without permission, you'd be sewn into a leather sack and tossed into the sea. This isn't some grim fairy tale. This is the documented reality of a system so twisted it makes your worst day look like a vacation. You're probably thinking, come on, it can't be that bad. Royalty, palaces, luxury. How horrific could it be? Oh, buckle up because we're about to dive into a history so dark that even European ambassadors, who were totally fine with burning witches, were left speechless. For 500 years, the Ottoman Empire ran a machine of industrialized femicide, wrapped in silk and justified by bureaucracy. Every death had paperwork. Every execution followed protocol. Every woman who disappeared was a calculated loss in a system designed to control, consume, and discard human lives. This isn't the harem you've seen in movies with belly dancers and Turkish delight. This is the truth, a beautiful nightmare where survival meant losing your soul. Let's set the stage. It's the 16th century, and the Ottoman Empire is at its peak, stretching from Vienna to Baghdad. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul is the epicenter, a sprawling complex of marble, courtyards, golden domes, and secret corridors. The imperial harem, tucked inside, is where the Sultan's women, his concubines, mothers, and sisters, lived. To the outside world, it's a mysterious, exotic place, a symbol of power and pleasure. But step inside, and it's a different story. Picture 400 women, some as young as 13, locked in a gilded cage. They're not queens or princesses. Most are slaves, kidnapped from villages across Eastern Europe, Africa, or the Caucasus, sold at markets, and trained to serve. Their lives revolve around one man, the Sultan, and a single, terrifying ritual that happens every night. As the sun sets over Istanbul, the palace transforms into a gambling den where the stakes are life and death. A silver tray is prepared in the Sultan's private chambers, adorned with small pieces of parchment, each bearing a woman's name. The Sultan doesn't even pick the name himself. That would be too much responsibility. Instead, eunuchs, the palace's enforcers, draw a name in a twisted lottery. If your name is called, you're escorted to the Sultan's chambers. Sounds like an honor, right? Except winning could mean power or a one-way ticket to the Bosphorus Strait. The women know this. They sit in their opulent quarters, dressed in silks, surrounded by luxury, praying their name isn't drawn. Because being chosen comes with a price, and the cost is often your life. Let's walk through selection night, because this is where the horror starts to hit home. Palace record from 1640 give us a chilling glimpse. At exactly 8 p.m., the chief black eunuch, a man named Sunbul Aga, would enter the harem quarters. The women, aged 13 to 25, would be lined up in the Golden Hall, standing like products in a showroom. The air is thick with fear, but they're trained to hide it. Any sign of reluctance, fear, or, God forbid, Physical impurity like menstruation could mean immediate consequences. The silver tray, carried by two junior eunuchs, makes its way through the corridors, guarded by soldiers. The journey takes exactly 12 minutes. They timed it with obsessive precision. On November 15th, 1640, on her period, that was her death sentence. The official record lists Aisha's cause of death as sudden illness. But the truth, whispered among servants and recorded by European observers, is far uglier. She was likely strangled with a silk cord, a method chosen because it left no marks and spilled no blood, aligning with Islamic laws that forbade harming royal bodies. Her body might have been wrapped in a sack and dumped into the Bosphorus, where the currents would carry it away. The Ottoman Empire wants you to forget this part of their history. They want you to. It was a clinical evaluation of whether she deserved to keep her reproductive organs. If the answer was no, procedures were scheduled. Think forced sterilization or worse. If yes, she'd proceed to the Sultan's chambers, knowing that failure to conceive within a set time frame meant revisiting that awful question. Only 10 out of 400 women in the harem would ever bear children. The rest lived in a state of perpetual waiting, knowing that being forgotten was their best hope. Because being chosen repeatedly without producing an heir made you a liability. Palace record from March 3rd, 1652, showed 23 women were relocated in a single night. All had been chosen multiple times without conceiving. The official term was reassignment, but servant accounts paint a darker picture. Many were taken to the Bosphorus, never to be seen again. The psychological torture was deliberate. Ottoman historian Dr. Fatma Gacek found documents showing the randomness of the selection was carefully calibrated. They wanted the women to feel just enough hope to keep them compliant, but never enough to feel secure. It was psychological warfare perfected over centuries, turning victims into competitors who sabotaged each other to survive. This system wasn't just cruel, it was a business. Each woman was an investment, costing the equivalent of $5,000 to purchase and $500 annually to maintain in today's money. The harem cost the empire $2 million a year, a fortune at the time. Why spend so much? Because it wasn't just about the Sultan's pleasure. It was a political tool. By controlling reproduction, the empire ensured pure bloodlines and prevented rival dynasties through marriage. They even twisted Islamic law to justify it, declaring natural bodily functions impure and pregnancy outside official selection as theft from the Sultan. Women's bodies were state property, and the state decided their fate. Supervisors. They had customer service standards for murder, and the women knew it. They lived in constant fear, not just of the Sultan, but of their own biology. Imagine waking up every day knowing a natural process could get you killed. Imagine competing with 399 other women, knowing only a handful would survive past 30. This was the harem's reality, not a romantic fantasy, but a machine designed to consume lives. As we move deeper into this nightmare, we're going to see what happened after a woman's name was drawn, when the Real Terror kicked in. The selection process was just the beginning. The Ottoman harem had methods of control and disposal so precise, they'd make a modern corporation jealous. And trust me, once you hear how they turn murder into an art form, you'll understand why. This history was buried for so long. Let's keep going, because the truth is worth knowing. The silver tray has just passed through the Golden Hall. A name has been drawn, and the air in Topkapi Palace is thick with dread. You're one of the 400 women in the harem, and whether your name was called or not, the terror doesn't end. Last time, we saw how the selection process turned the harem into a deadly lottery where winning could mean power or silent trip to the Bosphorus. But what happened after your name was drawn? That's where the real nightmare begins, because the Ottoman harem wasn't just a prison. It was a machine designed to control every aspect of a woman's body and mind. Let's walk through the horrors that followed selection, because this system was so calculated. It makes modern bureaucracies look like amateurs. If your name came up, you were escorted through candlelit corridors, past guards who avoided your gaze, to the preparation chambers. This wasn't a pampering session. You'd be surrounded by 12 eunuchs, all trained in anatomy, staring at you like a specimen under a microscope. Their job was to decide if your body was worthy of the Sultan. They'd ask that chilling question, should the sea be preserved? Your entire future, your life, hinged on their answer. If they said yes, you'd be sent to the Sultan's chambers, expected to perform perfectly. If you conceived, you might climb the ranks, maybe even become a valide sultan, mother to a future ruler. But if you didn't, or if they deemed you unfit, the consequences were brutal. Forced sterilizations, secret surgeries, or a quiet disappearance into the night. What did unfit mean in this twisted world? The Ottomans were obsessed with purity, not just spiritual, but physical. If you were on your period, you were unclean. If you didn't conceive after a set number of encounters, you were useless. If you showed too much intelligence or defiance, you were dangerous. Palace records from the 16th century reveal they kept meticulous logs of every woman's biological cycles, periods, pregnancies, even moods, tracked with the precision of a modern database. If you were impure when chosen, like Aisha in 1640, whose story we mentioned last time, you were done for. Her death was logged as sudden illness, but the whispers among servants told the truth, strangled or drowned for a biological function she couldn't control. Thousands faced the same fate, their deaths erased with a stroke of a pen. But it wasn't just about biology. The harem system was designed to break your spirit. If you survived the night with the Sultan, you lived under a ticking clock. You had a limited window, usually a year or two, to produce an heir. Fail, and you became a liability. Palace ledgers from 1652 show 23 women relocated in a single night, all because they didn't conceive after multiple selections. Relocated where? The Bosphorus. Strait. Servants spoke of boats leaving the palace at midnight, carrying leather sacks that moved and screamed. The currents swept them to the Black Sea, where no one would find them. Local fishermen called these spots mermaid graveyards and refused to cast their nets there. This wasn't folklore. It was a grim reality repeated year after year. The psychological toll was relentless. Dr. Fatma Gacek, a modern Ottoman historian, uncovered documents showing the selection process was rigged to keep women on edge. The randomness wasn't random at all. They'd pick certain women more often, usually younger ones, aged 16 to 18, from regions like Circassia or Georgia, prized for their beauty. Women who showed too much intelligence or education were deliberately ignored. The Sultan wanted bodies, not minds. This wasn't just about reproduction. It was about control. They wanted women who'd obey without question, who'd compete against each other instead of uniting against their oppressors. And compete they did. The harem turned victims into accomplices. Women would spy on each other, reporting rivals' periods or illnesses to gain favor. Some even drank potions to induce sterility, preferring barrenness to the terror of selection. A French ambassador in 1675, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, wrote about women who'd rather destroy their bodies than face the silver. Try again. Imagine that. Choosing permanent harm over the chance of being chosen. That's how bad it was. The system fostered betrayal, ensuring the women never formed a united front. It was divide and conquer, executed with chilling efficiency. Now, let's talk money, because the harem wasn't just a prison, it was a business. Each woman was a financial asset, purchased for around 50 gold coins, about $5,000 today, and maintained at a cost of 20 coins a year. The entire harem cost the empire $2 million annually, adjusted for inflation. Why spend so much? Because the harem was a political tool. By controlling reproduction, the empire ensured pure bloodlines and prevented rival dynasties through marriage. Every woman was a cog in a machine that maintained the sultan's absolute power. And when a cog broke, when a woman didn't produce an heir or became troublesome, she was replaced. The empire had supply chains for humans, with standing orders at slave markets from Crimea to Sudan. The religious angle makes it even uglier. Islamic law was twisted to justify this horror. Natural functions like menstruation were labeled impure, not by the Quran, but by palace clerics who needed excuses to dispose of women. Pregnancy outside the selection process was called theft from the Sultan, as if a woman's body belonged to the state. These weren't religious rulings. They were bureaucratic ones, dressed up in holy language to silence dissent. Palace records show clerics issued fatwas declaring that disruptive women spread corruption, making their elimination not just permissible, but necessary. It's the kind of mental gymnastics that turns murder into a divine act. The harem's cruelty wasn't just physical. The psychological warfare was next level. Women lived in a state of constant dread, knowing their fate could hinge on something as uncontrollable as their biology. They were fed, clothed, and educated, but it was all a facade. The education was about obedience, not empowerment. They learned poetry, music, and dance to please the Sultan, not to enrich their minds. And a luxury? It was a trap. The silk dresses, the golden jewelry, the perfumed baths, they were all part of the illusion that kept women compliant. You're surrounded by beauty, but one wrong move, and you're gone. That's the harem's true face. A death factory disguised as a palace. This system of control was horrifying, but the way they disposed of women who didn't fit was even worse. The Ottomans didn't just kill, they turned murder into an art form, with methods so refined they had employee handbooks. We're about to dive into those execution methods, from silk cords to leather sacks, and trust me, the details will make your skin crawl. The harem's machine didn't just break bodies, it erased them, and we're going to see how they did it next. We've just walked through the harem's deadly selection process, where a silver tray decided your fate and the psychological torture that kept women competing for survival. But what happened when the system decided you were no longer useful? That's where the Ottoman harem's true horror comes into focus, because they didn't just dispose of women. They turned killing into a refined, bureaucratic process. The methods were so precise, so civilized, they make medieval torture look crude. This wasn't about public executions or messy beheadings. The Ottomans had a problem. They needed to kill regularly, but Islamic law forbade spilling royal blood. So they got creative, turning murder into an art form, where the canvas was human suffering and the paint was silk and seawater. Let's dive into the chilling ways they erased women from existence. Imagine you're in the harem, maybe 19 years old, and you've either failed to conceive, broken some unspoken rule, or simply had your period at the wrong time. The palace can't keep you around. You're a liability now. But they can't just chop your head off. That's too public, too bloody. Instead, they developed methods so clean and quiet that the outside world barely noticed. The most common was the silk cord, wielded by professional stranglers called bastanchi, literally gardeners, because they pruned the Sultan's human garden. These weren't random thugs. They were trained in anatomy, practicing on animals, until they could kill in under 30 seconds. The silk cord was chosen for a reason. It left no marks, spilled no blood, and was quick. A clean death for an unclean woman. The technique was meticulous. 3 feet of cord, twisted 7 times for strength. One man held your shoulders, another looped the cord around your neck. If it took longer than 45 seconds, the strangler faced punishment for causing unnecessary suffering. They had performance reviews for murder. But the physical act was only half the horror. The psychological torture started hours before. If you were marked for execution, you weren't killed right away. They'd tell you it's sunset, giving you one long, agonizing night to prepare. Palace records show women spent those hours writing letters to families they'd never see again, letters that were never sent. Imagine sitting in your luxurious room, surrounded by silk and gold, knowing dawn brings your death. Your crime? Maybe you didn't. Smile convincingly enough when your name was drawn. Then there's the C punishment, or Denise Ceci, which takes cruelty to another level. If you got pregnant without permission, say, from a guard or another forbidden encounter, you faced a fate so horrific it's hard to fathom. They'd sew you into a leather sack, often with live cats to ensure panic and prevent floating. A special black boat, used only for this purpose, would launch on moonless nights. They'd row to a spot in the Bosphorus where the currents were strongest, guaranteeing your body would vanish into the Black Sea. From 1520 to 1680, records indicate at least 3,000 women met this end. 18 per year, every year for 160 years. The Bosphorus became a mass grave, so notorious that fishermen avoided certain areas, calling them mermaid graveyards. The Ottomans thought this was merciful compared to Christian punishments for adultery. They saw themselves as progressive. That's the twisted logic we're dealing with. Not all executions were so dramatic. Some were slower, crueler, designed to break your soul before your body. Banishment to the Eski Saray, the old palace, was a death sentence in disguise. This decaying building on Istanbul's outskirts was where they sent women past their prime or guilty of minor infractions. No visitors, no letters, no hope, just hundreds of women left to rot. A French diplomat in 1670 described it as a marble tomb filled with living ghosts. The silence was so oppressive that women developed their own sign language because speaking was discouraged. They created a culture of the condemned, waiting for death in a place that smelled of mold and despair. 4 higher status women, those who'd borne children or held titles. Strangulation was too crude. Instead, they got the special sherbet, a poison that tasted of almonds and killed within hours. The palace had a chief poisoner who grew toxic plants in a private garden and tested formulas on condemned criminals. This wasn't a side hustle. It was a full-time job with a budget line. A silk strangulation cost 3 aki, about the price of a decent meal. A drowning expedition? 20 aki, including boat rental and crew wages. Banishment was practically free, just a one-time transport fee. The empire kept ledgers for these expenses, treating murder like any other business cost. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. The executioners weren't monsters. They were regular palace employees, men with families, maybe even pets. They went home after strangling a 17-year-old girl and kissed their daughters goodnight. Palace medical record from the 1600s show executioners had the highest rates of melancholy and night terrors among staff. One strangler's journal, found in 1987, is 400 pages of apologies to his victims. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but the system demanded it, and the system was relentless. Every execution was documented in triplicate, date, time, method, reason, and a satisfaction rating. A good execution was quick and quiet. A bad one took too long or left evidence. The most chilling method was reserved for escape. Attempts, the stone punishment, or tas suku. If you tried to flee, they didn't just kill you, they erased you. You'd be sealed alive inside the palace walls, becoming part of the structure that imprisoned you. In 2010, archaeologists renovating Topkapi found human remains in multiple walls, confirming centuries-old rumors. These women weren't just killed, they were made to disappear. Their stories buried in the very walls that trapped them. This wasn't just a harem, it was a death factory. But the Ottomans didn't stop at women. They had another system, just as brutal. To feed their war machine, the Divserm, a child collection program that makes modern human trafficking look amateur. Let's step outside the harem and follow the boys stolen from their families. Because their story is the next piece of this nightmare, and it's just as horrifying. The harem's execution methods were a masterclass in cruelty, turning murder into a bureaucratic art form. But the Ottoman Empire's horrors didn't end with the women locked in Topkapi Palace. They had another system, just as calculated, that targeted children, specifically young boys. This was the Divserm, a program so efficient it makes modern human trafficking look disorganized. While the harem consumed women to control succession, the Divserm stole boys to build the empire's army and administration. It wasn't just about taking kids, it was about breaking them, reprogramming them, and turning them into loyal cogs in the Ottoman machine. And the worst part? It was official state policy, complete with quotas, inspections, and paperwork. Welcome to the harvest of sorrow. Imagine a village in the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, or Bosnia around 1550. It's dawn, and Ottoman soldiers surround the settlement. Families huddle in their homes, praying this isn't the year. Every 3 to 7 years, officials swept through Christian territories, collecting boys aged 8 to 18. The Divserm, which translates to collection or gathering, sounds almost benign, like they were collecting taxes. But the tribute was human lives. These weren't random rates. The empire had specifications. Hey, strength, intelligence, even dental records. They were shopping for boys like you'd shop for livestock, and they didn't hide it. The scene was the same in every village. The Divserm officer, helpless, as their sons were evaluated like meat. If a boy was chosen, he was marked, sometimes with a tattoo or brand, and taken away. Families knew they'd likely never see him again. The numbers are staggering. Between 1450 and 1650, the Ottomans collected around 200,000 boys, 1,000 per year for 2 centuries. Entire regions were stripped of young males. Some Balkan villages had no boys between 10 and 18 for generations. The empire set quotas based on population, and if they couldn't find enough quality candidates, they'd lower standards, taking boys as young as 6 or as old as 20. The only requirement? They had to be Christian because Islamic law offered some protections to Muslims. These boys had none. The journey to Istanbul was called the Death March by survivors. River of children flowing toward Constantinople, growing shorter every few miles as boys collapse. The guard didn't stop. They cut the dead from the chains and kept moving. Mothers followed today, distance, weeping, until soldiers drove them back. Once in Istanbul, the real breaking began. Boys were given new Muslim names, their Christian names forbidden under penalty of beating. They were circumcised, often without anesthesia, as a physical mark of their new identity. Their native languages were banned, their faith erased. The goal wasn't just to train them, it was to destroy who they were and rebuild them as tools of the empire. The survivors were sent to one of two places: military training camps to become janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, or the palace schools to become administrators. Both paths were brutal, but the schools were a different kind of horror. The palace schools, called Indarun, looked impressive on paper. Boys learned languages, math. In the dormitories, where a predatory hierarchy ruled, new boys, called Oglin, were at the bottom, subject to the rights of older students. These rights were codified, senior boys could claim younger ones as their Oglin, a term that sanitized abuse as mentorship. The school administration not only knew but orchestrated it. A French observer in 1650 wrote, "The beautiful boys are passed around like communal property. Those who resist face beatings or starvation. Those who comply get privileges." Twice a year, the schools held exhibitions where boys were dressed in tight costumes, painted with makeup, and paraded before officials and dignitaries. These weren't academic showcases, they were auctions. Visitors bid for private tutoring sessions, with the school taking a 60% cut. The boys' earnings went into accounts they could access if they graduated, if they survived. Medical records tell a grim story. 40% of students had injuries consistent with assault, and melancholic temperament was a euphemism for suicide attempts. One guard's diary from 1640 to 1645 lists 31 boys who fell from a tower with safety railings. They didn't fall, they jumped. The psychological manipulation was relentless. Boys were taught their suffering was holy, that submitting to seniors was a form of worship. Palace imams issued rulings to justify it, twisting scripture to normalize trauma. Escape attempts were met with punishments like the marble treatment, standing naked on cold stone for hours, or the memory hall, a dark pit where boys were left with minimal food. The system didn't just break bodies, it broke spirits, turning victims into zealots. The most successful graduates became janissaries or administrators, so loyal they'd raid their own villages for new recruits. The oppressed became oppressors, perpetuating the cycle. This was the Devserm's twisted genius. It created fanatics with no ties to their past, no loyalties except to the Sultan. But it came at a cost, leaving scars in the Balkans' DNA and folklore. The system only ended in 1648, not out of moral outrage, but because firearms made elite infantry less valuable, and Muslim families began bribing officials to include their sons for the opportunities. The machine collapsed under its own logic, but not before devouring countless lives. Yet, in the midst of this horror, one woman in the harem didn't just survive, she conquered it. Her story, coming up next, shows that sometimes the only way to beat a nightmare is to become its master. The Devserm system showed us how the Ottoman Empire turned children into tools, breaking their spirits to build an empire. But back in the harem, one woman didn't just endure this nightmare, she turned it into her weapon. Her name was Alexandra Lisowska, better known as Roxolana or Harem Sultan, and her story is a chilling blend of survival, manipulation, and the cost of power. She was a 15-year-old girl ripped from her village, thrown into the harem's deadly machine, and emerged as one of the most powerful women in history. But to beat the system, she became something darker than her captors. Let's dive into her story, because it's as inspiring as it is terrifying, and it shows what it takes to survive when the odds are stacked against you. It's 1,520, and Alexandra is helping her father, an Orthodox priest, in Ukrainian village. She's picking wildflowers, maybe daydreaming about a simple life, when Crimean Tatar raiders storm in. Within hours, her world is gone. Family slaughtered, village burned, and she's chained with dozens of other girls, headed to Istanbul's slave markets. She's 15, scared, and alone, but something in her shifts. While other girls weep for their families, Alexandra studies her captors. She realizes tears mean weakness, and weakness means death. So she buries Alexandra and creates Roxolana, a persona so perfectly crafted it becomes her armor. When she arrives at Topkapi Palace, she's thrown into the harem with 400 other women, all competing for survival. Most are paralyzed by fear. But Roxolana is different. She's watching, learning, adapting. Palace records from 1521 show she mastered Turkish, Arabic, and Persian in just 6 months. Not just conversational skills, but perfect fluency. Other women reported seeing her practice until her mouth bled, repeating phrases to erase her accent. Language wasn't just communication, it was camouflage. She understood that. Blending and meant surviving. But language was just her first weapon. Roxolana studied Sultan Suleiman like he was a puzzle to be solved. She memorized his routines, his tastes, his moods. When he liked poetry, she became a poet. When he showed interest in politics, she crafted opinions that complemented his. She didn't just mirror him, she became his intellectual soulmate. Modern psychologists call her tactics intermittent reinforcement, a manipulation technique where she be warm one moment, distant the next, keeping Suleiman hooked on figuring her out. It's the kind of mind game that wouldn't be studied formally for another 400 years. In 1524, she pulled off a stunt that cemented her legend. The palace caught fire, a common event in wooden structures, lit by oil lamps. While everyone else fled, Roxolana stayed behind, risking her life to save Suleiman's favorite poetry manuscript. Except here's the twist. Forensic analysis of the fire patterns, uncovered centuries later, suggests it started in a storage room only she had access to. Did she set the fire to play the hero? We'll never know for sure, but the timing was suspiciously perfect. That act of bravery made her indispensable to Suleiman, and she was on her way to the top. Her biggest coup came in 1534. For 500 years, Ottoman sultans never married. It complicated succession and invited political alliances. Roxolana changed that. She convinced Suleiman their love was above tradition, using letters that historians now call masterclasses in manipulation. Every word was calculated, every emotion calibrated to push him toward breaking centuries of precedent. She didn't just want power, she wanted permanence. And she got it, becoming the first concubine to marry a sultan. But marriage and 6 children weren't enough. The heir apparent, Prince Mustafa, was Suleiman's son by another woman, popular, competent, and a threat to Roxolana's sons. He had to go. She didn't use poison or assassins. That was too obvious. Instead, she spent 3 years planning doubts. She had agents spread rumors about Mustafa's ambitions, forged letters suggesting rebellion, and arranged for Suleiman to overhear conversations about Mustafa's growing power. In 1553, Suleiman ordered his son strangled. Roxolana watched from behind a screen, showing no emotion. She'd become what the system demanded, a survivor without a conscience. Her poetry from this period is chilling. On the surface, it's beautiful love poems to Suleiman, but read them knowing what she did and their psychological warfare. One verse, written the week after Mustafa's death, calls Suleiman's paranoia wisdom and his cruelty justice. She'd learned the harem's ultimate lesson. Love was a weapon, and she wielded it like a blade. But can we blame her? The harem had no retirement plan. Once her children grew, or Suleiman's interest faded, she'd have been discarded like thousands before her. Her monstrous acts were rational in an irrational system. Roxolana built a network of 150 informants to stay ahead of plots and threats. She turned the harem's culture of betrayal into her personal intelligence service. Historians like Dr. Leslie Pierce call her a feminist icon for breaking gender barriers. She advised Suleiman, patronized architecture, and corresponded with foreign leaders. But she also caused the deaths of at least 40 people, including children who threatened her sons. She lived in a palace paid for by slave trading, smiled at the man who owned her, and wrote love poems while orchestrating murders. Her last letter, written on her deathbed in 1558, is haunting. My Sultan, I go ahead to prepare paradise for you. History will remember our love. Let them forget the rest. She knew what she'd done and felt no remorse. In a system where 397 out of 400 women died forgotten, she chose to live as a monster. Roxolana's story shows the harem's paradox. The only way to win was to lose your humanity. But most women didn't have her cunning. For them, the palace had other plans, disposal methods so refined. They make medieval torture look honest. We've seen some of those, but the scale of this horror is in the numbers. The Ottoman Empire kept records like a modern corporation, and those ledgers reveal a truth that shatters every romanticized myth. Let's dive into the mathematics of misery next, because the stats tell a story of industrialized femicide that's hard to believe. Roxolana's rise from slave to sultana was a masterclass in survival, but it came at a horrific cost. Her story is the exception, a rare victory in a system designed to destroy. For most women in the Ottoman harem, there was no triumph, no power, just a machine that consumed them with ruthless efficiency. To understand the true scale of this nightmare, we need to look at the numbers, the cold, hard data that the empire meticulously recorded. The Ottomans kept ledgers like a modern corporation. Every purchase, every death, every disappeared woman cataloged in books that survived when the women didn't. When historians finally cracked open these archives in the 1960s, they found a truth that dismantles every romanticized myth about the harem. 400 women entered. 3 survived to old age. That's not a metaphor. That's math, and it's time to break it down. The harem housed 300 to 400 women at any given time, from the 1520s to the 1680s. The average stay was just 4.7 years, not because they were released or married off, but because they died or vanished. The turnover was so high the palace needed 80 to 100 new women annually to keep the number steady. These weren't volunteers. They were slaves bought at markets from places like Circassia, Georgia, or Sudan, at a cost of about 50 gold coins each, $5,000 in today's money. Maintaining them cost another 20 coins a year. The entire harem system burned through 40,000 gold coins annually, roughly $8 million today. That's a fortune for an empire, but they saw it as an investment in control. The age demographics tell a brutal story. The average entry age was 14 to 16. The median age in the harem was 19. By 25, you were considered mature. By 30, you were elderly. Finding a woman over 35 was so rare they were. Statistical outliers. Where do they all go? The ledgers give us clues. The budget for relocations averaged 3,000 gold coins a year, enough to transport about 150 women. But transport where? The records list vague destinations like Eski Saray, provincial assignments, or the chilling special arrangements. Follow the money. and you end up at the Bosphorus ferry operators, paid regularly for night services. Those weren't pleasure cruises, they were trips to dump bodies. Death certificates, when they existed, tell a story of impossible coincidences. Between 1550 and 1650, 847 women died of sudden illness, 623 of melancholy, 445 of accidents, 234 of unknown causes, and 89 of childbirth complications. That's 2,238 deaths in a century from a population, never exceeding 400. The entire harem was replaced every 5 years. Think about that. Every 5 years, 400 women vanished, and 400 new ones took their place. Their names appear in entry logs, expense reports, then nothing. They became ghosts in the paperwork. But the unchosen faced a different kind of death, psychological annihilation. Only 10 to 15 women were ever selected to sleep with. The Sultan. The rest, hundreds of them, lived in perpetual waiting. They were fed, clothed, and educated, but it was all a lie. The education taught obedience, not freedom. The food kept them alive, not healthy. Medical records show widespread malnutrition despite abundant meals, epidemic levels of hysteria and melancholy, and pregnancy rates far below biological norms. The system wasn't just killing women, it was breaking their bodies and minds. One reign stands out for its brutality, Sultan Ibrahim's in the 1640s. His taste for larger women led to a 300% spike in harem deaths. Hundreds of unsuitable women were disposed of to make room for new ones. The bureaucracy didn't flinch. They tripled the relocation budget and increased boat services. Efficiency was their god. When plague hit Istanbul in 1625, killing 60 harem women in a week, the palace restocked within 2 months. They had supply chains for humans, more reliable than their military logistics. The generational trauma shows up in the numbers too. Women who became Velite sultans, mothers of sultans, had an average of 2.3 children, far below the era's norm. Even the winners carried scars that affected reproduction. But the most chilling stat is the normalization rate. New arrivals showed severe distress for about 6 months, crying, resisting, trying to escape. After that, they adapted. They stopped fighting. They accepted their fate. The palace knew exactly how long it took to break a human spirit and built their training around it. Economists studying these records have calculated the return on investment. Each woman generated about 200 gold coins in value through labor, entertainment, or reproduction against a cost of 75 coins. That's a 166% ROI. The empire profited from femicide, with forms that had checkboxes for disposal methods and efficiency ratings for executioners. Murder was paperwork. Suffering was spreadsheets. How did this system last 500 years? That's the question we need to answer next, because the harem and divserm didn't survive by accident. They were defended by religion, economics, and even the victims themselves. The empire's collapse was the only thing that stopped it, and even then, the fight to keep it was fierce. Let's explore how this nightmare kept running and what it took to finally end it. The numbers we just uncovered, too. 238 women gone in a century. A harem replaced every 5 years. Paint a picture of industrialized horror. But how does a system this horrific last for half a millennium? That's what we're diving into. Now, because the Ottoman harem and its child-stealing counterpart, the divserm, weren't just brutal. They were pillars of the empire's power, propped up by a web of religion, economics, and twisted loyalty. They were defended by everyone from clerics to merchants to the victims themselves, all bound by fear, greed, and brainwashing. And when reform finally came, it wasn't because the Ottomans saw the light. It was the empire's collapse that forced change. Let's unpack how this nightmare kept running and why it took a civilization's fall to stop it. The harem and divserm were more than cruel systems. They were essential to Ottoman control. The harem ensured the Sultan's bloodline stayed pure and free from rival dynasties by controlling reproduction. The divserm created a loyal army and administration with no ties to local tribes or families. Both were wildly expensive, $8 million a year for the harem alone, but the empire saw it as worth it. Absolute power was the goal, and humans were the currency. Every woman purchased, every boy stolen, was an investment in the Sultan's unchallenged rule. The system's defenders weren't just the sultans or their officials. They included clerics who twisted religion, merchants who profited, and even victims who became enforcers, all trapped in a cycle that made horror routine. Religion was the glue that held it together. Palace clerics mangled Islamic law to justify the brutality. Menstruation was declared impure, not by the Quran, but by administrators who needed reasons to kill. Pregnancy outside the selection process was labeled theft, as if women's bodies were state property. Fatwas, religious rulings, declared that disruptive women or rebellious boys spread corruption, making their elimination a holy act. These weren't fringe interpretations. They were official policy issued by imams who quoted scripture while signing execution orders. It's the kind of moral acrobatics that lets you sleep at night. After drowning a 17-year-old girl, economics drove the machine too. The harem and divserm were big business. Slave markets from Crimea to Sudan thrived on Ottoman demand, with standing orders for women and boys. Merchants made fortunes selling humans, while palace officials profited from managing the systems. Executioners had salaries, boats had crews, and every death had a budget line, 3 Aki for strangulation, 20 for drowning. The empire saved millions by stealing boys instead of recruiting soldiers, and the harem's products, heirs and entertainment, generated political and cultural value. It was a perverse ROI, calculated to the last coin. The most insidious defense came from within. The harem's women and divserm's boys were conditioned to uphold the system. In the harem, women competed, betrayed, and sabotaged each other, hoping to climb the ranks or just survive. Some, like Roxolana, became enforcers, wielding power over others to secure their own safety. In the divserm, boys who survived the palace schools became janissaries or administrators, so loyal they'd raid their own villages for new recruits. The system turned victims into accomplices, using trauma to create loyalty. It's Stockholm Syndrome on an industrial scale. When reform finally came, it was driven by external pressure and internal collapse, not morality. The Tanzimat reforms of 1839 under Sultan Abdülmecid I were sparked by European criticism and growing internal dissent. The Hadi Sharif of Gulhane, an imperial edict, promised equality and human rights. Sounds noble, right? Except the palace fought tooth and nail to keep its human collection. The Harem Revolt of 1840 saw eunuchs and senior women, like the Valide Sultan, resist change. They spread rumors that ending slavery would anger Allah, bribed clerics for fatwas, and even accidentally strangled 3 reformist officials. The message was clear. Change meant war. The 1854 Slavery Abolition Decree was a step forward, but it exempted the imperial harem. The 1876 Constitution guaranteed rights, except for palace women. Every reform had carve-outs, like trying to end slavery while keeping the plantation. Real change needed force. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought military officers who had no stake in the harem or divserm. They stormed Topkapi, documented the horrors, and began releasing women. What they found was gut-wrenching. One woman, freed in 1909 at age 60, had been in the harem since she was 12. She didn't know her real name or life outside the walls. When offered freedom, she begged to stay. The outside world was scarier than her prison. The testimony of Safai Nur, recorded in 1924, captures the tragedy. They tell me I'm free now. Free to do what? I know 13 ways to. Please a man I never loved. I speak 4 languages, but can't read a street sign. They gave us education for slavery and called it culture. This was the harem's legacy. Broken lives, erased identities, and a system that made freedom feel like a punishment. But even as the empire crumbled, its defenders clung to their privilege, using religion and tradition to justify the unjustifiable. How did this history get buried? And why is it still controversial today? That's what we'll explore next, because the harem is now a museum, but its horrors are glossed over, and the truth keeps fighting to surface. The harem and divserm systems were defended fiercely, even as the Ottoman Empire crumbled, showing just how deeply entrenched this horror was. But once the empire fell, how did such a massive, documented atrocity get swept under the rug? That's what we're diving into now, because the Ottoman harem's legacy wasn't just left behind, it was deliberately sanitized. Today, Topkapi Palace is a museum visited by 3 million tourists a year who snap selfies in the harem quarters, marveling at the tiles and gold. The gift shop sells harem nights perfume, and TV shows like The Magnificent Century turn it into a soap opera of romance and intrigue. But the truth, silk cords, drowned women, stolen children, is buried under layers of revisionism. Let's uncover how this history was whitewashed and why telling it remains a battle. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, its records didn't vanish. They were locked away. The harem's ledgers, execution logs, and slave purchase receipts were stored in archives, inaccessible until the 1960s when historians like Dr. Madeline Zilfi and Dr. Leslie Pierce started digging. What they found was explosive, evidence of industrialized femicide and child abuse on a scale that dwarfed most historical atrocities. But the new Turkish Republic, built on the empire's ashes, wasn't eager to air this dirty laundry. The harem was reframed as a cultural institution, a symbol of Ottoman sophistication. Textbooks focused on architecture and administration, not the Bosphorus as. A mass grave. Touristification played a huge role. When Topkapi became a museum in 1924, it was marketed as a window into Ottoman grandeur. The harem quarters were restored, but the restoration was selective. Workers found hidden rooms with human remains under marble floors, 17 burial sites in total. But the discoveries were hushed up. Bones were reburied quietly, and the public was fed stories of luxury and romance. Guidebooks mention concubines and sultans' mothers, but not the silk strangulations or the sea punishment. The gift shop's harem nights, perfume doesn't come with a warning. Label about the women sewn into sacks with cats. Media has done its part to romanticize the horror. Shows like The Magnificent Century turn Roxolana into a love story, focusing on her romance with Suleiman while glossing over her role in murders. They show silk dresses, not silk nooses. Palace intrigue is dramatized, but systematic femicide is left out. It's not just Turkish media, Western films and novels have long portrayed the harem as an exotic fantasy, a place of seduction and power plays. The reality, women living in terror, children broken in palace schools, doesn't sell as well. Archaeological evidence keeps trying to tell the truth. In 2010, construction near Topkapi uncovered a mass grave. 90% women, aged 15 to 25, many showing signs of violence. The project was relocated. The bones reburied without fanfare. The past was covered up again. Historians face pushback too. Dr. Zilfi, who wrote Women in Slavery in the Late Ottoman Empire, received death threats. Dr. Pierce was accused of spreading Western propaganda. Academic conferences on Ottoman slavery are protested, with critics claiming they attack Turkish heritage. The truth is seen as a betrayal, but the evidence is overwhelming. Digitized archives are making it harder to hide. Sales receipts for humans, execution orders for pregnant women, budgets for body disposal. They're all there, preserved in the empire's meticulous paperwork. The bureaucracy of death left too much evidence to erase. Yet the romanticization persists, because it's easier to sell a fairy tale than confront a genocide. Every wedding photo at Topkapi is taken on crime scene. Every tourist admiring the tiles walks over bloodstains. The gardens they photograph were fertilized with human remains. Beauty and horror were partners, not opposites. This sanitization isn't just about the past. It's a warning for the present. When we romanticize history, we enable modern abuses. Human trafficking today generates $150 billion a year. Forced marriages affect 15 million women. Honor killings claim 5,000 lives annually. The methods have evolved, but the mindset, treating humans as property, remains. By forgetting the harem's reality, we risk repeating its lessons. What does this history teach us about human nature, and why does it matter today? That's what we'll explore next, because the harem's story isn't just about the past. It's a mirror for our world. The sanitization of the harem's history shows how easily we can bury the truth under myths and merchandise, but the bones under Topkapi's floors keep whispering. We've seen the harem's deadly machine, the Divserm's child theft, Roxolana's ruthless survival, and the efforts to whitewash it all. Now let's ask the big question. What does this 500-year nightmare teach us? This isn't just a story about the Ottoman Empire. It's a warning about human nature, institutional evil, and our dangerous ability to normalize atrocity. The harem and Divserm weren't run by monsters. They were run by ordinary people, clerics, guards, even victims, because the system demanded it. Let's explore the lessons this history holds and why they hit so hard today. The first lesson is about power. When humans can own other humans, horror follows. The harem treated women as property, their bodies controlled by a bureaucracy that decided who lived, who died, and who reproduced. The Divserm turned boys into tools, stripping their identities to serve the empire. Both systems show what happens when power is absolute and unchecked. The Sultan's word was law, but the real machinery was the thousands of people who enforced it. Eunuchs, clerics, executioners, all doing their jobs. They weren't evil in a cartoonish way. They were regular people, following orders, filling out forms, going home to their families. That's what makes it terrifying. Ordinary humans can operate extraordinary evil when the system normalizes it. Tradition was another enabler. The Ottomans wrapped their brutality in culture and religion, making it untouchable. Palace clerics used fatwas to justify murder, claiming women who disrupted harmony were corrupt. Divserm boys were told their suffering was holy, their submission a form of worship. Tradition gave the horror a veneer of legitimacy, silencing dissent. Today, We see echoes of this when cultural practices, like honor killings or forced marriages, are defended as heritage. The harem shows how tradition can become a shield for abuse and how hard it is to challenge when it's ingrained. Economics drove the machine too. The harem and divserm were profitable. Slave markets thrived, executioners were paid, and the empire saved millions by stealing boys. Instead of recruiting soldiers, each woman generated a 166% return on investment, each boy a loyal servant with no cost to the state. This wasn't just cruelty, it was business. Modern parallels are stark. Human trafficking is a $150 billion industry because people are still seen as commodities. When profit trumps human rights, systems like the harem emerge, whether in 16th century Istanbul or 21st century sweatshops. The victim's complicity is the hardest pill to swallow. Women in the harem betrayed each other to survive. Divserm boys became janissaries, raiding villages like their own. Roxolana orchestrated murders to secure her children's future. The system turned the oppressed into oppressors, using trauma to create loyalty. It's a brutal reminder that survival can twist human nature. Today we call this Stockholm Syndrome, but in the harem, it was strategy. When freedom isn't an option, some choose to wield the whip rather than feel it. The harem's normalization is the scariest lesson. For 500 years, millions participated, buying, selling, guarding, killing. It wasn't hidden. European ambassadors wrote reports. Travelers described the horrors. Yet it continued. Because humans can normalize anything given time and justification. The harem's ledgers, with their checkboxes for disposal methods, show how bureaucracy can sanitize murder. We see this today in systems that dehumanize, detention centers, sweatshops, or trafficking networks, where paperwork and protocol make horror feel routine. Forgetting is the final danger. The harem's truth was buried under romanticized narratives, from tourist brochures to TV dramas. Every harem night's perfume bottle dishonors the women who died. Every sanitized drama erases their suffering. Memory matters because forgetting enables repetition. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights exists because of horrors like this. Article 4 bans slavery because of the divserm. Article 5 forbids torture because of silk. Courts. Our freedoms are written in the blood of history's victims, and they're not guaranteed. They require vigilance. The harem's lessons are urgent, but how do we apply them? That's what we'll wrap up next with a call to action. The women and boys who suffered can't speak, but their stories demand to be heard. What we do with this knowledge, whether we let it fade or use it to fight modern abuses, will define whether we've learned anything at all. We've walked through 500 years of horror, from the harem's deadly silver tray to the divserm's stolen boys, from Roxolana's ruthless survival, to the lessons that echo in our world today. The Ottoman Empire's palace of nightmares is gone. Its hall's now a museum where tourists snap photos and buy harem nights trinkets. But the mindset that built it, the belief that humans can be owned, that tradition can justify cruelty, that profit trumps lives, still lingers. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a warning, a mirror held up to our own world, and a call to action. Let's close this out by reflecting on what we've learned and why it matters. Because the harem's victims deserve to be remembered, and their stories demand we act. The Ottoman harem wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a machine that consumed 400 women every 5 years, leaving only 3 survivors per generation. The divserm stole 200,000 boys, turning them into soldiers or servants through trauma and reprogramming. These systems thrive because ordinary people, clerks, guards, even victims kept them running. The silk cords that strangled. Women, the leather sacks that drowned them, the walls that entombed them. They were tools of a bureaucracy that made murder routine. The ledgers, with their execution ratings and budget lines, show how horror can hide behind paperwork. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic, profitable, and justified by religion and tradition. Roxolana's story shows the cost of survival. She beat the harem by becoming worse than her captors, orchestrating murders to secure her place. Her triumph was real, but it came at the price of her soul. The Divserm boys who became janissaries, raiding their own villages, tell a similar story. Survival often means embracing the system that broke you. These aren't just Ottoman stories, they're human ones. Today, 40 million people are trapped in modern slavery. 15 million women face forced marriages. 5,000 die in honor killings each year. The methods have changed, but the mentality, treating humans as property, persists. The sanitization of this history is a betrayal. Topkapi's museum hides the bones under its floors, the mass graves near its walls. TV shows like The Magnificent Century turn Roxolana into a love story, ignoring the blood on her hands and the system that forced her to spill it. Tourists marvel at tiles cleaned of blood, gardens fertilized by bodies. When we romanticize the past, we dishonor its victims and enable modern abuses. Every harem night's perfume bottle is a lie. Every exotic drama, a whitewash. Memory matters because forgetting lets history repeat. So, what's the lesson? Human nature can normalize anything. The harem ran for 500 years because people accepted it. Merchants sold slaves, clerics wrote fatwas, executioners filled out forms. Foreign ambassadors saw the horrors and did nothing, some even participating. Today, we see echoes in systems that commodify humans. Trafficking networks, forced labor, oppressive traditions. The harem shows how abuse becomes routine when wrapped in culture, how profit silences morality, how victims can become enforcers to survive. It's a warning that our freedoms, your freedom, are fragile. They exist because people fought systems like this, and they'll only endure if we keep fighting. Let's talk gratitude for a moment. Tonight, you'll sleep without fearing a silver tray. Your body won't be inventoried. Your children won't be stolen by the state. These seem like basic rights, but for millions in history and millions today, they're a fantasy. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with its bans on slavery and torture, was written in the blood of the harem's women and Divserm's boys. But rights aren't self-sustaining. They need you. When you see human dignity violated, remember the 397 women who vanished for every 3 who survived. When tradition excuses abuse, think of the fatwas that justified murder. When profit overrides humanity, recall the budget. Lines for silk cords. The Ottoman Empire fell, but its blueprints remain in human nature. Wherever people are commodified, wherever power lacks accountability, the harem's shadow lingers. The women and boys who suffered can't speak, but their stories echo in the archives, in the bones under Topkapi, in the DNA of traumatized regions. What will you do with their truth? Will you be another tourist, snapping selfies at a crime scene? Will you consume sanitized dramas that erase real pain? Or will you remember, speak, and act? The harem is a museum now. Let's keep it that way, a relic of horror never to be repeated. If this story shook you, good. If it made you angry, better. If it made you grateful for your freedom, best. Subscribe to WTF History for more hidden truths that challenge what you thought you knew. Drop a comment below. What romanticized history do you think hides a nightmare? Share this with someone who needs to know that beauty often comes at a horrific cost. Next week, we're diving into another empire's secrets, because forgetting history doesn't just repeat it, it enables it. Stay curious, stay critical, stay free. 400 entered, 3 survived. Behind every statistic was a human. Behind every tradition might be tragedy. Don't let their stories fade.